river, the birds, the wind, feel the wind and the sun on my skin, the rock that I'm sitting on, my heart beating and the breath going in and out. Any other sensations or vibrations that are flowing through me. And I invite you to do the same. I've been trying to find my pathway into communicating, talking about the things that I find interesting, spirituality, consciousness, life in general, how to deal with emotions. And I think the first thing that I wanted to say is that I'm not a teacher in the sense that I have any knowledge or information that anyone else isn't capable of experiencing for themselves. I have experienced many heightened states of consciousness as well as many, many low states of consciousness, and that roller coaster is still very visceral for me at times. Times where I'm not sure what reality is. Not that anyone really does, but oftentimes people think they do. But that awareness can either be positive or negative. It can feel very scary at times, and it can feel very beautiful and peaceful at times. And there's this quote, and I'm not very good at remembering names a lot of the time, but this quote about how the mystic swims joyfully in the same waters that the psychotic drowns in. And I think it's really important to bring up because from my experience and my understanding, when it comes to mental health issues, more often than not, those things are linked to our reactivity to past traumas. And if you're interested in exploring more of that concept of how our mental health or health in general is linked to trauma, I highly recommend Gabor Mate, who is a doctor who has really spent a lot of time studying the effects of trauma, and that our mental health is not so much just some sort of genetic flaw with us or something like that, but more that even if there is certain things maybe written into our DNA from our families, it's oftentimes linked through the traumas of our ancestors, and also how we were raised and how our parents were raised and how the societies that they lived in and all of that. But that's, I feel, pretty available knowledge out in the world, and explore as you will. I bring it up because I think it's important to do our best to shift away from the narrative of there's something wrong with me, and recognize that I do in fact have the power, the ability to grow through these experiences, to evolve. And not to say that that's easy. In my experience, it's often extremely painful. But another concept around pain is that I like to play with is that the pain, other than the initial kind of burst of pain of being hit or something like that, a lot of the times the pain that we experience goes beyond just the initial trauma point, and a lot it has to do with the fear that we hold on to, the fear of experiencing the pain. And if we can allow ourselves to just relax and open up to it, that oftentimes we're able to more carefully, kindly, lovingly observe and move through those states in a way that, that the resistance of pain isn't creating more, and that we are able to heal more effectively, or perhaps more quickly. But it also involves a lot of kind of internal insight and investigation and uprooting negative belief systems and that kind of thing. But going back to what I said about the mystic and the psychotic swimming in the same waters, is that if you're raised in a culture that teaches you that hearing voices or having experiences that are outside of normal or outside of the material plane of existence, if you are having experiences that are unusual in some way or scare somebody else because of their limiting beliefs, you are then labeled as crazy or of having something wrong with you. And the more you're taught that, and the more that you believe it, the more that your own mind and perceptions experience that reality in that way. And so if you're raised, however, in a culture that has ties to shamanism or magic or mysticism or some other way of looking at states of consciousness that are beyond this physical plane, you can be taught how to see that joyfully and playfully and lovingly and with curiosity, and to learn from it and grow with it, rather than fighting. You're not having that resistance of, oh no, something's wrong with me, I need to push this away, but rather learning how to observe and to be with and to embrace, and ultimately how to work with that energy in a way that benefits ourselves, and through that process ultimately ends up being a benefit to others and all beings. I think something that I've noticed a lot when it comes to kind of healing, mental health, culture, relationship kind of guidance or advice or therapy, there's often a lot of othering. It's kind of like what to do when you're in a situation with a narcissist, what to do, it's always like talking about this other person who has done harm to you, rather than acknowledging the ways that the narcissistic personality traits that I carry within myself, or the ways that when I'm in a reactive state of mind, I may be more, there are traits that may be aligned with borderline personality disorder, or I've even had somebody suggest to me once that perhaps I'm schizophrenic because I behaved or moved in certain ways that reminded them of somebody that they knew who had schizophrenia. And I'm not even here to say those things aren't true. Although I've gone to therapy for many years, though I'm not in therapy at this moment. And never once was I diagnosed with a personality disorder or with schizophrenia or anything like that. I think that these are states of consciousness that anyone can experience. And so the more we're holding on to anger or fearful or negative ways of seeing ourselves or the world around us, the easier it is to dip into those traits. And if we get lost in that kind of downward spiral into that cycle of fear and anger and negativity, that it can be very destructive for ourselves and for the people around us. And I think it's incredibly important to acknowledge those pieces within ourselves, and not as a way of shaming ourselves, not a way of putting ourselves down, because that continues that negative spiral. But if we're always saying, oh, narcissists are like this, or, people with BPD are like this, or, schizophrenia, it's like this, then we're always kind of othering it, while also never kind of like acknowledging it and taking responsibility for it without these feelings of shame or guilt tied to it. And so often when we find ourselves in judgment of others, there's a part of us that is in discomfort or in pain, maybe some way that we've been taught to kind of ignore certain parts of ourselves or to alienate those parts. And many years ago, I was in a play. I used to do a lot of acting, which is an interesting experience, being an actor. But I was in a play, an adaptation of Jekyll and Hyde, and that story is very, very much about a person who perceives themselves as good, but sees that there's this kind of darkness within himself, and he tries to cut it off. And in trying to cut it off, he actually empowers and emboldens this dark side of himself to kind of manifest into its own kind of entity that then really wreaks havoc, because he's not allowing himself to embrace all sides of himself. There was a really cool graphic that I saw recently that has been on my mind recently about perspective and dimensionality, or multidimensionality, where there's a cylinder floating in a room, and there are two walls behind it, and then a light cast on it in one way that shows the shadow behind it as a circle, and then another light shining against the other wall that's showing the shadow as a rectangle. And so now, taking that concept that things look different from different perspectives, if you're only seeing, 2 dimensions, or, you're seeing a very limited aspect. If you're seeing 2 dimensions of a 3-dimensional object, you are not taking in the full information. And now, recognizing that there are not just 3 dimensions, though that is what the human body is able to perceive in normal, everyday waking consciousness. But the multi-dimensionality of our universe goes well beyond that, and I have no idea how many, if it's infinite or if it's 7 or like whatever. But to understand that we are these multi-dimensional beings, or multi-personality beings even, and not using that as like, again, not as like a mental health issue. And I think that becomes a mental health issue, again, out of experiences of trauma, where people feel they need to kind of split different aspects of themselves in order to get the protection that they need in certain situations. But if we can recognize that we are all displaying certain aspects of our personality at one time, but then in other situations, different aspects of our personality may arise or be on display. So again, if we're feeling angry or emotionally reactive in some way, those trauma reactions are coming out, versus when we're in a calm state of being, versus when we're in a joyful or playful state of being, or when we're feeling more introverted or extroverted or whatever. That I'm not any one description of any experience that anyone has ever had of me, nor of my own experience of this limited human form, or even beyond into other heightened states of consciousness that I've experienced. Again, that's only one limited perspective from one possible understanding of things. And also, memory is also imperfect, and so like we're kind of like building our stories of who we are based on memories that may or may not be true, and all that really is the current moment, right here, right now anyway. So it's like we're creating our past to begin with to fit the narrative of what I'm experiencing in this moment. And so all of this is to say, slow down, take a moment to be here, to be now, to let go of the stories that we have in our minds, to recognize that they're not ultimate truth, they're limited perspective, they're a two-dimensional shadow of a three-dimensional object, or something akin to that. But no one who has caused harm hasn't been harmed themselves, and no one who is a victim hasn't in some way also caused some sort of harm in their lifetimes. And I'm not saying an infant that is abused has caused somebody harm at that time, but they will continue to go through their life if they survive. And it's impossible to be a wounded human and to not rub up against anybody's stuff at all. And so I think there's a way to acknowledge that just because I do or say something that rubs you the wrong way, or you do or say something that rubs me the wrong way, doesn't mean that either one of us is wrong or bad. But we're kind of going through this process of the stones kind of like being worn down over time, so that we're not so rough and become more smooth. And if we can allow for that process, to be more compassionate for each other as well as ourselves, we can get through that process of smoothing the stones with less resistance, with less pain as a result. And that doesn't mean that if you're in a relationship where you're getting triggered all the time, that you just have to endure it because you're trying to smooth your stone or whatever. You do what you need to do in order to find those states of clarity and peace and truth and love and compassion as much as you possibly can. Because if you're not taking care of yourself, you certainly can't take care of somebody else who's going through something like that without also being caught up in the reactivity of it. And not that you have to be a perfectly enlightened being before you ever lend somebody a hand, but recognize what our boundaries are, what our capacity is to be able to support one another. And support is something I want to talk about more. I've been going through a lot of experiences recently of really feeling like I, in many ways, didn't have the support that I needed. But also I can look and see many other ways that I've had an incredible amount of support beyond what I can express my gratitude for. The incredible privileges that I've had. And so I'm trying to learn how to reframe the way that I see things so that when I'm not receiving support in the way that I wish it would come, to recognize, okay, this is a moment where I need to either think outside the box, try to find another avenue of getting that support, or there's a reason why I am being asked to look at this within myself on my own, to dig up the limiting beliefs that I'm holding on to and to release them. Because I'm somehow attracting these experiences. This is, a process of taking ownership, taking responsibility for my behaviors and my experiences in life, so that I'm not getting lost in those states of disorder or poor mental health. Not that those things won't come up from time to time. And I gotta say, it's incredibly challenging when they do, and I tend to isolate because I don't want to cause harm to anyone around me. But then in that isolation, I feel incredibly alone, and wanting to reach out to people and wanting to have more authentic connection. But if I'm reaching out from a place of experiencing lack or loneliness or whatever, then I'm not really vibrating at the level of really true, authentic connectivity that it is that I'm seeking anyway. So, and a helpful reframing that I had recently was, rather than framing it those times of introspection or poor mental health, even that, see, like that, it's like a negative description of the experience. So saying that I'm experiencing depression or I'm experiencing anxiety is keeping me in that mind frame of what I'm experiencing is somehow bad or wrong, or something's wrong with me, or why can't I let this go, or whatever. So rather than depression, reframing it as compression, a time of looking inward and healing and growth to be able to recharge and rejuvenate and to fully come back into this new rebirth and to who I'm becoming. Just like the image of the caterpillar that goes into its cocoon and then liquidizes into goo, like completely dissolves, and then has to reform and come back out into the butterfly. But But we as human beings, as these multidimensional beings, if we are truly allowing ourselves, rather than fighting the resistance the whole way, I believe that we are kind of like constantly kind of going through these cycles of birth and death and birth and death and birth and death and birth and death. And to allow it, to embrace it, rather than getting caught in the resistance or the fear that something's wrong with me, or why am I not over this yet, or point being to give ourselves that time, that permission, that allowance, that we're not always going to have our shit together, and that's not a problem. That's not, if we allow ourselves to experience it and to observe what's coming up for us, to truly see it without trying to overthink it. Just allow for that experience of all these fears or anger or confusion or whatever. That I need more time to isolate before I can reemerge. Or going through an experience where I'm the one who's being narcissistic in this situation. Being able to admit that, to look at it and not just be like, oh, this other person was a narcissist and that's why this relationship didn't work. I was reacting out of my own self-interest. Not that that's a bad thing, to want to do what's right for us, but to be able to acknowledge when we're so blinded by our own self-interest that we're not really fully able to take all information in about somebody else's perspective, and to honor that, and to respect that, have reverence for this other person, or any other person, when we're so caught up in our own experience. And I very often find that I am very self-absorbed, and again, I don't even mean that in a negative sense. I'm often looking at myself and my behaviors, and so because that's what I spend a lot of my time observing, and I've spent plenty of time observing other people, especially as an actor, but that also brought in this quality of exploring my own experience of those states, that I am very self-absorbed, and I don't think that has to be a negative. And that's something I've struggled with for a long time, finding acceptance in that, and something I still do struggle with at times. So learning how to embrace that, to allow that this experience, this quality of my personality is here for a reason, to not shove it away, to not try to cut it off and allow it to become the monster of Mr. Hyde, but to be with it, to understand what is my body and mind, and what is my beingness asking for me to see and asking for me to understand, so that I can learn from it and grow through it and evolve and embrace it, and then ultimately be able to embrace all beings to the best of my ability. Anyway, I'll leave it at that for today. Thank you very much. Love to you all.